When a journalist describes a car as an axe-wielding barbarian laying waste to everything in its path, I'm guessing you wouldn't suspect he's talking about a Buick. This was a brand best known for building quiet, soft-riding cars made for dentists and retirees. Sure, Buick had flirted with performance back in the 1960s. Cars like the Grand Sport and GSX proved that they could make cars with a bit of muscle. The 1970 GS Stage 1 in particular was a torque monster that could hold its own with the best of the era, but by the late 1970s and into the 80s, that fire was gone. Buick had become synonymous with velour seats, opera windows, and vinyl roofs, a brand more concerned with ride quality than quarter-mile times. Their cars were heavy, underpowered, and built for comfort. If they'd ever had any reputation for performance, that was gone, which is what makes what happened next so shocking. You know what else is shocking? Really looking at your bank account and seeing just how much you probably spend on takeout. We really try to cook at home as much as possible, but there's just no getting around the ease of having someone else make your food and just having it ready to go. Well, I've got a great solution, one that's healthier, tastier, and cheaper than takeout. This is Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep, and there's a ton of variety, over 35 meals per week to choose from. Factor meals eliminate the hassle of prepping, cooking, or cleaning up. All you have to do is heat and then savor the good stuff, and it's really quality food. This is honestly a game changer. I'm constantly working on videos, and with 3 kids, we are just beyond busy. So finding time to make 3 good meals every single day, it just isn't easy. Meals kind of just hit us, and we're often scrambling to make something decent. This really solves that for at least some of the time. Factor is super flexible, you can adjust your orders, and you don't have to give up on all of your nutrition goals. So if this looks interesting to you guys, head to factor75.com or click on the link below and use code 50BartsCar to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50BartsCar at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video, and let's jump back in. If you spend entirely too much time watching videos about cars like I do, I'm guessing you've heard the term malaise. Automotive enthusiasts like to define different eras from history, and the malaise era was a term coined by automotive journalist Murray Martin back in 2007, referencing a Jimmy Carter speech from that time. Malaise is a French word that sort of implies a creeping sense of decline. More generally, this period in America was marked by a feeling among people that things were just going to keep going to crap, and that was especially true in the automotive world. We were in a funk. Now, it's not that all cars from this time were bad. Companies like BMW, for example, were really getting going at this time. It's just that in general, cars, and especially American cars, were in many ways getting worse. From ugly rubber bumpers to just a general loss in design appeal, especially in comparison with the 50s and 60s, the industrial collapse of Detroit, as millions of terrible cars were recalled and Pintos were exploding. But more importantly, there was a significant, unprecedented decline in performance, a not-so-slow death of American muscle. Of course, the oil crisis is to blame for this. Emissions regulations came in, and American V8s were choked of all that had made them great. A Corvette went from making 365 horsepower in 1970 and doing 0 to 60 in well under 6 seconds, to 1975 making like 165 horsepower and hitting 0 to 60 in about 8 seconds. Thankfully, that period ended right around 1984, where cars like the Mustang and Corvette began making at least over 200 horsepower. But sadly, many of the players in the muscle car horsepower race of the 60s were too busy doing other things or were gone. There would never be another Plymouth Hemi Cuda or Pontiac GTO. The Mustang and Corvette were essentially the last survivors of the classic American muscle car era. Ford and GM had stayed committed to these platforms despite their decline in horsepower, and it was finally beginning to pay off once again. But something was happening over at GM's luxury division known as Buick. The thing that was happening was a Boy Scouts program. All the way back in 1973, a sort of underground project was going on, headed up by Ken Baker, who decided to start a Boy Scouts program in Buick's engineering department. Now, Ken had no interest in survival skills. No, his Boy Scout program was to turbocharge their recent V6 with the goal of adding performance to their smaller cars and economy to their larger cars. Okay, this wasn't an actual Boy Scout program. That term was used to describe it because it was essentially that, this team of engineers just working and trying to figure out what they could do, and it was all very much extracurricular. They started in 1976 with the official pace car for the Indianapolis 500, the first pace car to be turbocharged. Lots of key innovations went into this pace car. It had a knock sensor, a pre-ignition control, and in 78, Buick would solidify themselves as the American pioneer of turbocharged technology with their first production turbocharged cars, the Regal Sport Coupe and the LeSabre Sport Coupe. At this point, the engine was making about 165 horsepower, not too bad. The performance capabilities were there, and so was the styling, including the iconic, slightly raised hood necessary for the engine to fit. Buick kept quietly refining the formula. That 3.8-liter turbo V6 may have started as a clever engineering side project, but it gradually became central to Buick's identity. They were true innovators in making this technology work for production cars. By the early 80s, performance was starting to matter again, and Buick was ready. In 1982, they introduced a special edition Regal to celebrate its success in NASCAR. It was called the Grand National, named after the NASCAR Winning Cup Grand National Series, and it was first unveiled in 82 at the Daytona 500. Now, you know the malaise era, that hopeless time in American automotive development. You know it was coming to an end when a company like Buick starts thinking about making fun cars again. The goal was to reach a new audience. Buick knew that if something didn't change in their approach, they would slowly die like an aging social club. And so the primary goal with the GN was to bring younger people into their showrooms. The first year Grand National wasn't a monster. Most were actually equipped with a naturally aspirated V6 and dressed up with cosmetic upgrades. But the idea was planted. By 84, Buick started getting serious. The Grand National now came standard with a fuel-injected, turbocharged 3.8-liter V6, making 200 horsepower. It was fast, stealthy, and completely unexpected from Buick, a brand known for soft, conservative cruisers. And in a time when muscle cars were mostly shadows of their former selves, the Grand National became a dark horse, literally. All black, no chrome, no flash, just a menacing, square-shouldered coupe that could outrun Camaros and Mustangs. A true sleeper car, and it kept getting faster. By 1986, Buick added an intercooler, boosting output to 235 horsepower and 330 foot-pounds of torque. The car was now comfortably running mid-14s in the quarter mile. This was a serious number in the mid-80s, and people started taking notice. Magazine tests showed that it could hang with or even beat a Corvette, and it was still a Buick. The spirit of Detroit was at least somewhat back, with the Mustang, the Corvette, and the Grand National all fighting to hold the spot as fastest production car. But you have to remember, two of these flagship models were under the same roof that is GM. The Corvette was and would always be America's sports car, and Corvette owners didn't like that Grand National owners were slapping bumper stickers on the back of their cars that read, "I brake for Corvettes." Buick was also playing advertising games with Chevy. Their car was making around 245 horsepower when the Chevy Corvette was making about 230, but they would just advertise it as 235. Then when GM would invest a whole bunch into their small block to get it to 240, Buick would just instantly switch their ads to read 245. In April of 1986, Car and Driver had this to say about the Grand National. Corvette, get out of town. Mustang, move over. Camaro, keep your back at the wall at all times. They clocked a 4.9 second 0 to 60 miles per hour quicker than a Corvette, most US marketed Ferraris, and even the Lamborghini Countach. Now this could not keep going. How could this lowly sedan that didn't appear to have any inkling of aerodynamics or sporty looks be competing with not only the most exotic international sports cars, but also the esteemed Chevy Corvette?
What value has Buick got to go out and build a super high-performance car that in many ways puts down the Corvette, puts down the Trans Am? That's not Buick's image.
Internal pressure from GM, and specifically the higher-ups at Chevy, meant that the Grand National had to go. There was nothing that the passionate engineers at Buick could do, so they decided to go out with a bang for the Grand National's final year, turning the still humble Grand National into an outright supercar, if only for 1 year. You know, most of the time, iconic, historically significant cars aren't built for that specific reason. Porsche was just trying to make a great sports car with the 911. The Bugatti Veyron was developed from the ground up for top speed. Those cars became icons, but this car was different. They knew that it was done, that there would be no more Grand Nationals. So it literally says in the internal memos, the goal is, and I quote, to create a limited production Buick Grand National that achieves a memorable place in the history of high-performance automobiles, one that car collectors will want to own and that automotive riders will never forget. They were trying to make a legend, and that's exactly what they did. For the Grand National Experimental, or GNX, they decided to partner with ASC McLaren in part to reach these astronomical performance marks, but also to not interrupt regular production at Buick. Buick sent over the current production Grand National to McLaren, where they began essentially modifying it. Rather than tear into the engine block or redesign internals like the crankshaft or pistons, they focused on everything around the engine, what engineers could call ancillary systems. The 3.8-liter turbocharged V6 remained internally stock, but they replaced the standard turbo with a larger Garrett T3, mounted a more efficient low-restriction intercooler, and added ceramic coating, tubular exhaust manifolds. A reworked ECU tune delivered more aggressive boost curves and firmer throttle response. These changes took the GNX from the Grand National's already impressive 245 horsepower to an apparent factory-rated 276 horsepower and 360 foot-pounds of torque, which are pretty crazy numbers for this time, but in practice, real-world testing showed that these numbers were very conservative. Dyno sheets and magazine tests frequently revealed over 300 horsepower and more than 400 foot-pounds of torque. Of course, raw power alone wouldn't cut it. The GNX needed to put that power down reliably and without a bunch of drama. To that end, McLaren and ASC developed a new torque arm rear suspension, which replaced the Grand National's standard 4-link setup. This not only reduced wheel hop, but significantly improved overall traction and ride quality. The car also received stiffer bushings, reinforced control arms, and a GNX-specific differential cover with cooling fins. The transmission, a GM204R 4-speed automatic, was recalibrated with a custom torque converter and shift programming to handle the surge of low-end torque. And the result was astonishing: 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds and a quarter mile in the low 13s, with some independent testers even recording trap speeds of over 103 miles per hour. These numbers matched or beat, Ferrari 328s, Porsche 911 Carreras, and even the Corvette Z51, and all of this was from a Buick and from a V6. Visually, the GNX was somehow both menacing but also restrained, like Darth Vader, but if he didn't have a cape. It had a deep black paint job like the Grand National, but it distinguished itself with fender-mounted heat extractors, 16-inch black mesh wheels, Goodyear Gatorback tires, and subtle GNX badging. Inside, the cabin was pretty much identical to the Grand National's, save for Stewart Warner analog gauges and a plaque on the dashboard indicating the car's production number out of 547. Yes, only 547 GNXs were ever built, each numbered and delivered with the clear intent of becoming a collector's item. Buick didn't hide that. They embraced it. The GNX was designed not just to be fast, but to matter. It was performance wrapped in myth, designed to go down in history as really the last muscle car of its kind and the fastest Buick ever built. And that's exactly what happened. This car was a reminder that performance could come from anywhere, even from a V6 taken from a Regal. In a decade ruled by C4 Corvettes and poster Ferraris, a blacked out Buick with a V6 managed to outrun the best of them and then just completely vanish. Now, you'll also know if you watched my last video that the limited GNX is the most expensive Buick ever with, adjustment for inflation. It was priced at just over $29K, but in reality, dealers were marking them up to over $50K and one even sold for $75K. Here's what Car and Driver had to say about the car in 1986. They said, "This is the fastest car we've tested this year, faster than a Corvette, faster than a Porsche 928, and way faster than anyone expects a Buick to be." This made the GNX the quickest US production-built car that year, faster than even a C4 Corvette with the Z51 performance package. Only a handful of European exotics could hang with it, Some independent tests reported quarter-mile times as low as 13.3 seconds. Testers consistently noted that the GNX torque came in like a rush thanks to this reworked Garrett turbo and a more efficient intercooler setup. Turbo lag was really minimal for this time, and once the boost hit, the GNX just launched like a missile, aided by a rear suspension designed to keep the tires planted and to keep the chassis flat. On the drag strip, the GNX was so feared because of its undercover vibe. It wasn't a flashy car. It looked like your uncle's Regal, but with a bit of an attitude problem. No hood scoop though, no wings, no bright colors, just black on black with mesh wheels. This meant that it was a perfect sleeper. At a time when flashy Camaros and Mustangs pulled up to the line, the GNX would just kind of silently spool up and then leave them all in the dust. And GNX owners realized quickly that they could run low 13s or even high 12s with pretty minimal mods, chip, exhaust, and slicks. For me, what makes the GNX so special and so legendary is that it wasn't built with exotic internals. Unlike the fully farmed out C4ZR1 engine, the GNX used the same iron block, crank, and rods as the regular Grand National. It was all about tuning, and for owners, it kept being all about tuning. McLaren and ASC upgraded everything around the engine: bigger, better turbo, better intercooler, custom suspension, and of course the ECU calibration. It was a masterclass in getting the most out of what you already had, which is a key part of American drag racing culture, especially at this time. In the end, the GNX wasn't just a car, it was a statement, kind of like a final flex from a company no one expected to build something this brutal, this advanced, and it would be unforgettable. For a brief, shining moment in 1987, it was Buick, not Chevrolet, not Ford, that made the fastest car in America. And the way they did it was just so old school. Most of what made up the car was pretty simple. It was much more like the old school muscle car formula than its competitors, and yet it was also decades ahead of its time. I mean, think about this. The GNX showed that you could take a lightweight turbo V6, pair it with a little bit of clever computer tuning, a refined drivetrain, and a stealthy appearance, and you could build a car that outran Corvettes and Ferraris. Fast forward 30 years, and look what performance cars are like today. Turbocharged inline 4s and V6s are now the norm. Brands like AMG, BMW, Ford, and even Porsche all rely on turbo V6s and 4-cylinders. Even just the idea of sleepers, fast cars that look ordinary, that's become a whole massive subculture. Sure, BMW and Alfa Romeo helped to define the sedan sports car segment, but I think the Grand National did as well. What Buick did in the mid to late 80s was way ahead of its time. It was kind of like a blueprint for modern performance thinking, decades before that thinking became mainstream. Now, I would love to hear from you if you've ever experienced this car. Let us know in the comments below, and thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Drive safe.